His wife had left him one thing he was not supposed to open until he needed it. He had kept it on the bottom shelf for 8 years without touching it. The morning the bank trucks pulled into his yard was the morning he finally understood what she meant. Virgil Cobb was 68 years old. He had worked the same 312 acres in Cedar Ridge, Iowa, since he was 24. He had never missed a property tax payment. He had never taken a government subsidy he did not earn. He had buried 2 dogs, 1 tractor, and the only woman he had ever loved on that land. And he had kept working every single morning after each of those losses because the land did not care about grief, and neither, in the end, did he. He was not a man who talked much. His neighbors knew him by the sound of his equipment more than by his voice. The Massey Ferguson starting up at 5:15 every morning, the slow drag of the disc harrow across the north field in April, the low knock of his pickup truck engine when he idled at the grain elevator waiting his turn. These were the sounds of Virgil Cobb, and Cedar Ridge had been hearing them for 4 decades without interruption. Dorothy had been the one who talked. Dorothy had been the one who remembered things. She kept a ledger for household expenses going back to 1987. She kept every insurance document in a fireproof box under the bed. She kept birthday cards from people who had been dead for 15 years because she said, "You never throw away proof that someone loved you." When she got sick the first time in 2003, she did not stop keeping records. She only became more careful about it. She died in the spring of 2016. She was 60 years old. Virgil did not sell a single acre after the funeral. He did not remodel the kitchen or paint the porch or do any of the things his sister suggested might help him move forward. He kept working. He kept the bottom shelf in the storage room exactly as Dorothy had left it, with the wooden box sitting in the same position she had placed it, the lid slightly off-center the way she always left it when she had been in there recently. He did not touch it. He told himself he was respecting her space. The truth was, he could not bring himself to open it without knowing why she had told him to wait. She had said it clearly 3 weeks before she passed. She was sitting in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table, the way she did when she was being serious about something. She looked at him and she said, "Virgil, there is a wooden box on the bottom shelf in the storage room. Do not open it until you need it. You will know when that is." He had nodded the way a man nods when he does not want to argue with a dying woman. He had assumed it was letters, old photographs, something sentimental she wanted him to find when the grief was bad enough that he needed a reason to keep going. He had never imagined it was evidence. The first sign that something was changing in Cedar Ridge came in early March of 2024 when the Hartwell Energy Corporation announced a natural gas pipeline project valued at $4.2 billion. The route ran directly through Polk County. The maps the company published showed the pipeline corridor cutting across the eastern edge of the county, which meant it ran through or adjacent to a significant portion of farmland that had been quiet and undervalued for years. The town responded the way small towns always respond to large money. Carefully at first, then loudly. Real estate agents appeared at the diner on Main Street with laptops and printed projections. Farmers who had been complaining about commodity prices for a decade were suddenly fielding phone calls from brokers they had never heard of. 2 of Virgil's neighbors sold within the first 3 weeks. One of them, a man named Dale Mercer who ran a hog operation 2 miles east, took a cash offer that was 60% above assessed value and shook hands on it in the parking lot of the Farm Bureau office on a Tuesday afternoon. Virgil went into town twice that first week, once for feed and once for a part the Ferguson needed. Both times he heard the same conversations at different volumes. At the co-op, 2 men he had known for 30 years were talking about what their sections might fetch if the corridor ran close enough. At the diner counter, a young man in a fleece vest with a company logo was spreading a laminated map across 2 tables and circling parcels with a marker. He looked up when Virgil came in and said, "Excuse me, sir, do you own property on Cedar Ridge Road?" Virgil looked at him for a moment. He said, "I do." The young man said, "I'd love to talk to you about some options." Virgil picked up his coffee from the counter, moved to a stool at the far end, and did not look back. The young man waited a moment and then turned back to his map. Virgil attended one community meeting at the township hall that week, sat in the back row, and left before the open comment period. He was not opposed to the pipeline. He was not interested in selling. The land was not a financial instrument to him. It was the place where Dorothy was buried, under the cottonwood at the edge of the south field, and he was not going to negotiate the coordinates of her grave with anyone holding a clipboard. He went home that evening and stood on the porch for a long time, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about what Dorothy had said to him once, years before she got sick, standing in almost the same spot. She had looked out at the fields in that way she had, like she was reading something written in the crops, and she had said, "This land will save you one day. Virgil, save it." He had smiled at the time. He had thought she was being poetic. Dorothy was like that sometimes. She said things that sounded like conclusions to conversations that had not happened yet. He went inside and made coffee and did not think about it again. The SUVs arrived on a Monday morning in the third week of March. Virgil was in the vegetable patch behind the house, turning compost into the bed he used for early tomatoes, when he heard the engines. Not one engine, several. Moving slowly down the gravel access road that connected his property to the county road, he straightened up and looked. 3 black SUVs with no markings, moving in a line like they had rehearsed it. He walked around to the front of the house and stood on the porch steps with his spade still in his hand. He did not walk toward them. He waited. That was something Dorothy always said about him. Virgil never walks toward trouble. He just stands there until trouble figures out it has to come to him. The vehicles stopped in a row in front of the house. 4 men got out of the first 2 vehicles. They wore suits. One of them carried a leather portfolio. The driver of the third vehicle stayed inside with the engine running. The man with the portfolio walked forward. He was younger than Virgil had expected. Late 30s, pressed shirt, no tie, dark hair cut close on the sides. He had the kind of face that had probably been considered sharp 15 years ago and had since hardened into something else entirely. Confident in the wrong way. The way of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. His name was Preston Hale. He was the branch manager of First Meridian Bank, Polk County. He did not offer his hand. He did not look at the land or the house or anything except Virgil's face. The way people look when they have already decided the conversation is a formality. He opened the portfolio and removed a document and held it out. He said, "Mr. Cobb, this is a formal notice of outstanding debt. The total amount currently owed to First Meridian Bank is $1,047,214. This debt is secured against the property at this address. You have 48 hours to remit full payment or arrange a formal payment conference, after which the bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings." Virgil did not take the document immediately. He looked at it from where he was standing, and then he looked at Preston Hale and he said, "I don't have a loan with your bank," Hale said. "Our records indicate otherwise. The original principal was $200,000, executed in 2003. With accrued interest and penalties, the current total is what I've just stated," Virgil said. "I never received that money." Hale said, "Our records show full disbursement on March 14th, 2003. I understand this may be difficult to process." He paused in a way that was not a pause for thought. It was a pause for effect. He said, "Perhaps you'd like to review the documents with a family member present." One of the men behind him shifted his weight. Something about the way they were standing, all of them at angles, made Virgil think of a formation, like they had done this before and they knew exactly where to put their feet. Virgil set the spade against the porch railing. He took the document. He read it without speaking. He read it twice. The signature on the contract inside the folder was his. He recognized it immediately. He recognized the year. He recognized the loan amount. He recognized none of the rest of it, because the rest of it had never happened. He set the papers down on the porch railing. He said, "I'll need to make some calls." Hale said, "Of course. You have 48 hours." He retrieved the document from the railing, left a copy in its place, and walked back to the lead SUV without a backward glance. The three vehicles backed out in a line and turned onto the county road and were gone. Virgil stood on the porch for a long time after the sound of their engines faded. His neighbor Ruth Keller was standing at her fence line 200 yards away. She had seen the whole thing. She did not wave. Virgil did not wave either. He picked up the copy and went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and read the documents again slowly. The loan contract bore his signature on 3 pages. The date matched a period he remembered clearly, not because of the bank, but because of everything else that was happening that year. Dorothy's diagnosis, the trips to Iowa City, the phone calls to his brother and his wife's sister, and everyone else he could think of who might be able to help. He remembered all of it in a way that the body remembers things, not just the mind. He remembered the feeling of that year, the specific weight of it, and nowhere in that weight was the memory of $200,000 arriving in any account he had ever owned. He drove to the bank the next morning without calling ahead. He made the 40-minute drive on county roads he had traveled his whole life and walked in through the glass door at 8:15. He asked the woman at the front desk to see the branch manager. She told him to take a seat. He stood instead, near the window, where he could see the teller stations and the customers at them. There was a woman at the second teller window. She was older, heavy-set, wearing a canvas jacket. She had a manila folder open on the counter, and she was pointing at something inside it. The teller across from her was shaking her head slowly. The woman with the folder said something that Virgil could not hear through the glass partition. The teller shook her head again and slid the folder back across the counter. The woman in the canvas jacket picked it up with both hands and held it against her chest and stood there for a moment before she turned and walked toward the exit. She passed within a few feet of where Virgil stood. She did not look at him. Her face had the look of someone who had been given an answer they already knew was coming and had not yet figured out what to do with it. Preston Hale came out of his office 15 minutes later. He did not look surprised to see Virgil. He gestured toward the back with a small motion, the kind of gesture that was technically polite but was actually dismissive, and Virgil followed him into a glass-walled office that looked out over the main floor. He sat across from Hale and told the truth. He told it plainly, one fact after the next, without embellishment. In 2003, his wife Dorothy had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The treatment she needed required surgery at a facility in Iowa City. The cost was beyond what their savings could cover. He had come to First Meridian and applied for a loan of $200,000, using the farm as collateral. The application was processed. The loan was approved. He had signed all the documents, but in the days immediately before the scheduled disbursement, he had lost his driver's license. It was his only valid government-issued identification. He had gone to the Polk County Sheriff's Department, reported the loss, and received an official loss report. He had brought that report back to the bank and asked them to accept it as a temporary measure while he waited for a replacement. The bank refused. They told him they could not release funds without a valid ID present at disbursement. He went back twice more. Both times he was told the same thing. Dorothy's surgery could not wait. He went to his brother in Dubuque, to his wife's sister in Davenport, to 3 friends from the county agricultural co-op, and to a man from their church who had helped him before. Between all of them, he gathered enough to cover the initial surgical costs. The loan, as far as he understood it, had been voided when the disbursement was refused. He never followed up because he had been sitting in a hospital waiting room for 11 days straight. And when it was over, he had a wife who needed 6 weeks of recovery care and a farm that needed to keep running. Hale listened. When Virgil finished, the branch manager opened a folder on the desk and turned it so Virgil could see it. It was a printout of the loan record. Disbursement dated March 14, 2003. 21 years of accrued interest, a total that matched the number on the notice exactly. Hale said, "Our system shows full disbursement. What you're describing is a memory of events from over 20 years ago." He let that sit for a moment. He said, It's not uncommon for people to misremember financial arrangements, particularly when they occurred during a period of personal stress. I understand your wife was ill. That must have been an extremely difficult time. There was something in the way he said it. Not unkind exactly, something calculated to land just below the threshold of what a person could reasonably object to. He continued. He said, "What I'd suggest is that you consult with a family member before pursuing this further. We are willing to discuss a structured repayment arrangement if you'd like to avoid foreclosure proceedings." One of the tellers at the nearest station glanced up. The way Hale had pitched his voice, not loudly but clearly, suggested he did not particularly mind if she had heard. Virgil said, "I am telling you that I did not receive that money," Hale said, "and I am telling you that our records indicate otherwise." He stood, which meant the meeting was over. He said, "We look forward to hearing from you within the 48-hour window." A security guard appeared at the office door. Virgil stood. He did not raise his voice or argue further. He walked out through the main floor and out through the glass door into the parking lot. He sat in the truck for a long time with his hands on the wheel and the engine off. He was not shaking. He was something quieter and heavier than angry. He was remembering. He sat there long enough that the morning light shifted across the dashboard. He was thinking about 2003. He was thinking about the specific Tuesday he had walked out of this same building, or the building that had stood here before this one, with the loss report in his hand and nothing else. He was thinking about standing in the parking lot that day in the cold, trying to decide what to do next. And a large man in a sheriff's uniform had been parked 2 spaces over, doing paperwork, and had looked up and asked him if he was all right. Virgil had said no, not particularly. The sheriff had listened to the short version of what had just happened inside. He had not offered solutions. He had just listened. And that had been enough to allow Virgil to get back in his truck and drive to his brother's house and start making phone calls. That sheriff had been Earl Donovan. Virgil started the engine and pointed the truck towards Cedar Ridge. That evening, he called his brother in Dubuque. He asked whether he remembered lending him money in the spring of 2003. His brother said of course he remembered. He had lent him $14,000, and Virgil had paid back every cent within 18 months. He asked if his brother still had any record of it. His brother said he would look through his old files. Then Virgil went to the storage room. He had not been in there for anything other than equipment for the better part of a year. It was a lean-to structure attached to the back of the house, converted from a porch sometime in the 1960s before he bought the property. Dorothy had organized it methodically over 4 decades. Metal shelving units along 2 walls, labeled boxes going back to the early years of their marriage, insurance documents, tax returns, equipment warranties, seed invoices, receipts from the grain elevator dating back to years when the elevator itself had been under different ownership. He started at the top shelf on the left and worked his way down and across. He read every label. He opened boxes that seemed relevant and went through them page by page. He found the property tax receipts from 2003. He found the crop insurance renewal from that year. He found a medical invoice from the University of Iowa hospitals, a single page with numbers on it that he held for a moment before placing it face down back in the box. He found a birthday card Dorothy had kept from someone named Agnes, who he could not immediately place. A photograph of the south field taken from the porch at a time when the cottonwood had been younger and thinner. A manual for a water pump that had broken down in 1998 and been replaced in 1999. Dorothy had kept the manual anyway because she had told him at the time, you never know. He did not find anything about the loan. It was after 1 in the morning when he reached the bottom shelf. His back was hurting in the specific way it hurt after long periods of bending over concrete. He had been through every labeled box he could find and had come up with nothing that touched the bank or the loan application or the weeks before Dorothy's surgery. The wooden box was in the far corner of the bottom shelf, behind 2 cardboard boxes that had been placed in front of it at some point. It was a medium-sized box made from white oak with a plain hinged lid. Dorothy had refinished it sometime in the 90s, sanding it smooth and oiling the wood once. It did not have a lock. It did not have a label. It was just a box. And Virgil had walked past it hundreds of times without opening it because she had told him not to until he needed it. He pulled it out and carried it to the workbench and set it down under the fluorescent light. He opened it. Inside, on top of a small stack of photographs and folded letters, was a plain white envelope. His name was written on the front in Dorothy's handwriting. Under his name, in the same hand, 4 words, "For when the time." He picked up the envelope. It was sealed. He held it for a moment and then opened it carefully along the top edge the way she always opened envelopes, without tearing. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. On it she had written in her clear, deliberate hand, "Virgil. In 2003, when they would not give us the loan, I kept the paperwork. The copy of your ID loss report from Earl Donovan's office is in this envelope. I also wrote down the date they refused the disbursement, March 13th, 2003. Earl was there when I called to ask what our options were. He remembered you. Keep this. It matters. Love, Dorothy." Beneath the folded sheet was a photocopied document. It was a copy of an official loss report from the Polk County Sheriff's Department. His name, his date of birth, the date of the report, the case number, the signature of the issuing officer, and at the bottom, a date stamp. March 11th, 2003. 3 days before the bank claimed they had disbursed the money. He stood at the workbench without moving. The fluorescent light hummed. Outside, somewhere out across the dark fields, something moved through the dry stubble and then went quiet. Dorothy had known. She had kept the proof. She had placed it in a box with his name on it and told him not to open it until he needed it. And then she had died 8 years ago, trusting that he would eventually need it and that he would be able to find it when that time came. He thought about her sitting at this same workbench or the kitchen table in the weeks after that refusal. He thought about her doing this alone, in a house where he was sleeping or working or worrying in a different room, while she was quietly writing down dates and making copies and sealing envelopes. She had just been told what was growing inside her. She had a husband who was trying to keep everything from falling apart, and she had decided, without telling him, that she would carry one particular piece of it herself, that she would hold it until he needed it, however long that took. He folded the sheet of paper and put it back in the envelope with the photocopy. He put the envelope in his shirt pocket. He put the wooden box back on the shelf in the corner where it had been and replaced the 2 cardboard boxes in front of it. He turned off the fluorescent light. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not thinking exactly, more like settling, the way ground settles after a long rain, slowly, finding its new level. Then he went to bed. There was work to do in the morning, and 48 hours was still enough time to do it right. He did not sleep much. He lay in the dark with his eyes open and his hands on his chest and thought about Dorothy sitting at the kitchen table in 2003 while he was somewhere in a hospital corridor in Iowa City trying to figure out how to keep their life from coming apart. She had been sick herself. She had just been told what was growing inside her. And instead of collapsing, she had picked up a pen and written down dates and names and case numbers because she understood, even then, that the truth needed a witness if it was going to survive. He got up before 5, made coffee, drank it at the kitchen window looking out at the dark fields, and then drove to find Nora Briggs. Nora kept an office above the hardware store on Callaway Street in the county seat. She had been practicing law in Polk County for 19 years, mostly estate work and agricultural disputes. She was not a courtroom lawyer in the theatrical sense. She was the kind of lawyer who read documents very carefully and asked questions that seemed simple until you realized they were not. Virgil had used her twice before, once for a fence line dispute when a neighboring property changed hands, and once when Dorothy's estate needed to be probated. Both times she had done exactly what she said she would do. Nothing more and nothing less. She was already at her desk when he arrived at 7:45. He handed her the photocopy from the envelope. He told her about the bank notice, about Preston Hale, about being escorted out of the building. He told her about the original loan application, the lost driver's license, the refusal at disbursement, and the years that followed. He told her about the wooden box and what Dorothy had written. Nora read the photocopy without speaking. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at him. She said, "This is a copy." He said, "Yes." She said, "The original would be in the county records archive. Sheriff's Department logs from 2003 if they've been maintained." He said, "Earl Donovan was sheriff then." She looked at the document again. She said, "The date on this copy is March 11th. The bank claims disbursement on March 14th. If the original record confirms this date, and if the bank's own lending protocols at that time required valid government ID at point of disbursement, then what they're claiming is procedurally impossible under their own rules." She paused. She said, "But a photocopy from a personal storage box will not be enough in front of a judge. Not against a bank with a complete loan file and a signed contract." He said, "I know. That's why I need the original." She said, "Earl Donovan has been retired for 9 years. He lives out on Breckenridge Road. If the county archive still has the logbooks from that period, there may be something. But Virgil, even if we find it, we have maybe 60 hours before First Meridian files its motion." He was already reaching for his jacket. He said, "Then I'd better go see Earl." He was almost to the door when Nora said his name. He turned. She said, "One more thing. When you were at the bank, did you recognize any staff members from 2003? He said, "No, none of them." She said, "Who processed your loan application back then? Do you remember a name?" He thought about it. He said there was a younger man, handled the paperwork start to finish. Name was Weston, Gary Weston. Nora wrote the name down. She said, "I'll see what I can find on him." Earl Donovan lived at the end of a gravel road 6 miles outside of town. The house was a white farmhouse with a covered porch and a detached garage that was larger than the house itself, which told you something about Earl's priorities. He had been a working mechanic before he ran for sheriff the first time in 1988. He had won 4 consecutive terms and retired in 2015 at 65, having seen, as he told people at the time, just about enough. Virgil pulled into the yard at 9:30. Earl was on the porch with a mug, wearing a canvas coat over a flannel shirt. He was a large man who had not diminished much with age. White hair cut short, hands that still looked like they had spent 30 years doing physical work, which they had. He watched Virgil park and climb out without any visible surprise. Virgil came up to the porch and Earl said, "Virgil Cobb, heard the Hartwell pipeline has people stirred up out your way." Virgil said, "That's part of it," Earl said. "Come up and sit." Virgil sat in the other chair and told Earl everything in the same order he had told Nora. Earl listened without interrupting. He did not shift in his chair. He did not look away. When Virgil got to the part about the wooden box and what was inside it, Earl set his mug down on the porch railing and did not pick it up again. When Virgil finished, Earl was quiet for a long moment. He looked out at the yard. Then he said, "I remember you. Not because of that report. I processed hundreds of those in a year. I remember you because on hot summer afternoons, when I was out doing welfare checks on the county roads, you used to pull over and hand a cold drink through your window without saying a word about it, just handed it over and drove on like it was nothing." Virgil did not say anything. Earl said, "You want to go through the archive," Virgil said, "if the logbooks still exist." Earl was quiet for another moment. He had been 9 years away from county business. He had built a life around not being pulled back into it. Virgil could see him sitting with that, feeling the weight of it. Then the large man set both hands on his knees and stood up with the deliberate movement of someone whose joints had their own opinions about cold mornings. He said, "The logbooks from my first 3 terms are in the county records facility on Maple. I know exactly where they'd be shelved." He looked at Virgil steadily. He said, "Let's go find it." They took Earl's truck. Earl still had a county access card from a consulting arrangement he maintained with the records department. The Polk County Records Facility was a converted warehouse on the east side of town, temperature controlled in the main section and inadequately heated in the older storage wing at the back where the physical records from the pre-digital era were kept. The woman at the front desk knew Earl and waved him through without a form. They walked to the older storage wing. 12-foot metal shelving units organized by department and year. The air smelled of old paper and the particular cold of a room that is heated just enough to prevent damage, but not enough for comfort. Earl moved along the sheriff's department section without hesitation until he reached the boxes marked 2002 to 2005. He ran his finger along the labels until he found the one marked Daily Log and Incident Reports, January through June 2003. He pulled the box and carried it to a folding table in the center of the room. Virgil stood beside him. Earl opened the box. Inside were 3 bound logbooks and a series of manila folders organized by month. Earl opened the logbook for the first quarter of the year. The entries were handwritten in the careful block print that had been standard for official documentation before computers took over the process. Each entry had a date, a case number, a brief description, and a signature. Earl turned pages steadily. He knew how the system worked and where things would be filed. Virgil watched without speaking. The only sound in the storage wing was the turn of pages and the distant hum of the building's ventilation. Earl stopped. He placed one finger on an entry and read it without speaking. Then he turned the logbook around on the table so Virgil could read it. The entry was dated March 11th, 2003. The case number matched the one on Dorothy's photocopy exactly. The description read loss report filed by V. Cobb, Cedar Ridge Road, RE driver's license, no suspicious circumstances, administrative file only. The signature at the bottom was Earl Donovan's own hand, the same signature he had put on thousands of documents over 27 years of public service. Below it, a date stamp from the department's internal processing system confirmed the report had been logged and closed the same day it was filed, March 11th, 2003. Virgil looked at the entry for a long time. He did not need to say anything, and Earl did not require him to. Earl said, "This logbook is an original county record. Department seal on the cover. My signature on the entry. It is admissible as a public document without further authentication." He paused. He said, "I will testify to it personally if it comes to that," Virgil said. "They may try to make that difficult for you." Earl looked at him. Virgil explained what Nora had flagged as a possibility, that a bank with resources and motivation might attempt to complicate the involvement of any witness. He did not have specifics yet, but the concern was real. Earl picked up the logbook and held it in both hands. He said, "I spent 27 years building a record that nobody ever questioned because I did every single thing according to the law. Every single thing." He set the book back down on the table. He said, "Let them come." They photographed every relevant page on Earl's phone. Virgil called Nora from the parking lot of the records facility. Earl leaned against the hood of his truck and watched. Nora answered on the second ring. Virgil told her what they had found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Get it to me today. We have less time than I thought." He said, "What happened?" She said, "First Meridian filed an emergency motion at 9 this morning requesting a temporary asset freeze. The court granted it pending a hearing. The hearing is in 63 hours. She paused. She said, "There is something else." I pulled Gary Weston from the state licensing database. He was a registered loan officer at First Meridian from 2001 to 2007. He has been doing private mortgage consulting out of Ames for the last 12 years. and I found something in the bank's filing submitted this morning. Virgil said. What? She said. They included a signed internal verification form dated March 14th, 2003. It states that the borrower presented valid government-issued photo identification at time of disbursement. The signature on that form is Gary Weston's. Virgil stood in the parking lot with the phone against his ear. He said, "That document is not real." Nora said, "I know, but we have to prove it." He said, "Weston was there. He handled everything. He knows that disbursement never happened." She said, "He may not be willing to say so. If that document is fraudulent and his signature is on it, he is implicated. People in that position do not usually volunteer information that puts them at legal risk." Virgil looked out across the lot. He was thinking about something that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the day before, something he could not quite reach until now. He said, "Nora, the Hartwell announcement came out 3 weeks ago." She said, "Yes." He said, "Before that, nobody was moving on this property. Nobody was calling about old files. Preston Hale has been at that branch for 5 years. If this debt had been sitting in their system for 21 years, why act now? 3 weeks after the pipeline made this land worth 10 times what it was." The line was quiet. Nora said, "Because if they can foreclose before you have time to retain counsel and mount a defense, they can push the property through a bank-controlled auction before Hartwell finalizes its easement agreements. A foreclosure auction does not carry the same protections for the original owner that a voluntary sale would," Virgil said. Hale knew about the pipeline. He moved the moment the announcement came out. Nora said, "That changes what we are dealing with. It is not just an old debt being collected. It is a coordinated action timed to a specific financial event." She paused. She said, "If we can establish that before a judge, along with what you have just found, this becomes significantly larger than a loan dispute." He said, "How much larger?" She said, "I do not know yet. Bring me that logbook today, and let me make some calls tonight." He ended the call and looked at Earl. He said, "They filed a verification form this morning with Gary Weston's signature on it. It says, 'I showed valid ID at disbursement on March 14th. Earl considered that. He said, "Real signature or fabricated?" Virgil said, "Nora thinks the document itself is not real." Earl said, "Then someone either tricked Weston into signing something he did not understand, or they put his name on it themselves." He picked up the logbook from the seat of the truck and handed it to Virgil. He said, "Take this to her. I will be there to testify whenever she needs me." Virgil took the book and held it for a moment, a plain brown cloth cover, worn at the corners, the kind of object that looked like nothing until you understood what was written inside it. He thought about Dorothy keeping the photocopy for all those years. He thought about Earl's signature at the bottom of an entry on a Tuesday morning in 2003, the same morning Virgil had been standing at a bank window being told there was nothing they could do without a valid ID. He said, "Earl, every time I have seen Gary Weston at the agricultural fair over the last 10 years, he turns the other way, never looks at me directly." Earl looked at him steadily. He said, "A man only avoids someone like that for one of two reasons. Either he is ashamed of something he did, or he is afraid of something he knows." Virgil put the logbook under his arm and got in the passenger seat. He said, "Either way, we are about to find out which one it is." Nora spent the rest of that day and most of the night making calls and pulling documents. She obtained a certified copy of First Meridian's internal lending protocols from 2003 through a federal banking disclosure request. The protocols were precise on the relevant point. No loan disbursement above $50,000 could be legally processed without the physical presence of the borrower and a valid government-issued photo identification document verified by the disbursing officer. The disbursing officer was required to log the identification number and type on a disbursement authorization form, and a copy of that form was required to be retained in the permanent loan file. She requested the complete loan file from First Meridian under the borrower's right of access. The bank's legal team responded within 2 hours with a partial file. The disbursement authorization form was not included. When she formally requested the missing document, the bank's attorney replied that the form was not required to be retained beyond 10 years under internal policy. Nora noted the response carefully. A document that was required to exist had been allowed to disappear on a timeline that was convenient. She kept moving. By the following morning, she had two additional pieces. The first came from a former First Meridian employee who had worked at the Polk County branch from 2004 to 2011 and agreed to speak informally. This person told her that the branch had, during the early 2000s, carried a number of what staff internally called shelf loans. These were files marked as dispersed in the system where the funds had actually been moved through internal accounts rather than released to borrowers. The practice had been directed by the branch manager at the time, a man named Stuart Roth, who had since retired to Florida. The purpose was to inflate the branch's disbursement numbers on quarterly performance reports, which directly affected Roth's bonus compensation. The second piece was Gary Weston's bankruptcy filing from 2009, 2 years after he left the bank. Among his listed creditors was a private entity loan that matched in amount and timing what might have been a payment made to secure his silence or cooperation at the time. Nora could not prove the connection yet. She noted it and kept it. She called Virgil at 6 the next morning. He picked up on the first ring. She told him about the shelf loans. She told him about the disbursement authorization form that had never been produced. She told him what she had found in Weston's bankruptcy file. When she was done, Virgil said, "How many other loans were handled this way?" She said, "I do not know yet. Possibly several." The former employee did not have specifics, only the general practice. He said, "These were all farmers." She said, "The ones mentioned were older borrowers, people with land as collateral, people who, if the funds were never actually dispersed, would not necessarily know they were still listed as active debtors until someone decided to collect." He thought about the woman he had seen in the bank lobby 2 days before, the canvas jacket, the folder held against her chest, the particular look on her face when the teller slid her papers back. He said, "There was a woman at the bank when I went in, older. She had documents and she was not getting anywhere with them." Nora said, "Can you describe her?" He described what he remembered. Nora said she would try to find out who the woman was. Then she said, "Virgil, I need to tell you one more thing. Before I called you this morning, I received a call from First Meridian's attorney. The bank is prepared to withdraw the foreclosure action entirely if you sign a settlement agreement. The terms are that you acknowledge the original debt, agree to a payment lien against the property rather than immediate cash, and agree not to pursue any further legal action against the bank related to this matter." He said, "They want me to say I owe them the money," she said, "and to give up the right to pursue them afterward." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No." She said, "I expected that. I wanted you to hear it so you understood what they are trying to avoid." He said, "What are they trying to avoid?" She said, "A judge seeing the logbook, a judge asking why the disbursement authorization form does not exist, a judge hearing sworn testimony from a retired county sheriff, and possibly a judge asking why there are other borrowers in a similar situation." She paused. She said, "They made that offer because they are not confident. That is the most important thing I can tell you right now." Virgil looked out the kitchen window. The fields were gray in the early light, flat and still. The land looked exactly as it always had. It did not know anything was happening. It just continued. He said, "What time is the hearing?" She said, 9 tomorrow morning, Polk County District Court, Judge Patricia Wren. He said, "Earl knows." She said, "Earl knows. Get some rest." He hung up and stood in the kitchen. The wooden box was on the table where he had placed it the night before. He had brought it in from the storage room without fully deciding to. He walked over and put one hand flat on the lid. The wood was cool and smooth. He did not open it. He stood there with his hand on it and thought about a woman who had been sick and frightened and had still found the clarity to write down the things that mattered, who had trusted him to find it when the time came, who had known, somehow, that the time would come. He removed his hand and went to find his good boots. He would need them in the morning. He slept 3 hours. His body was 68 years old and made its own decisions about certain things, but even it could not do much with a mind that was still turning everything over. He was up at 4:30, dressed by 5, and sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the wooden box across from him by 5:15. He did not open it. He had what he needed from it. He just wanted it in the room. He left for the county seat at 7, wanting time to walk before he went inside. He had been in the Polk County District Court building twice before in his life, both times for matters that required a signature rather than an argument. He did not know what to expect from the inside of a courtroom, and he did not want that uncertainty to be the thing on his mind when he walked through the door. Nora was on the front steps when he arrived, leather briefcase. The focused expression of someone who had prepared as much as preparation allows and had decided to trust what she had. She said, "Earl is already inside. He came early," Virgil said. "How are we?" She said, "We have what we have. It is enough." She looked at him directly. She said, "Let me do the talking unless Judge Wren addresses you. If she does, answer exactly what she asks, nothing more." He said he understood. She said, "Preston Hale will be there with attorneys from the regional legal team. They filed supplemental materials this morning. I have reviewed them. There is nothing new. When you do not have substance, you use volume." They went inside. The courtroom was smaller than Virgil had imagined, which somehow made it feel more serious rather than less. The ceiling was high, the wood was dark, and the light came from long windows on the south wall that put a pale stripe across the floor. There were perhaps 30 people in the gallery. Virgil recognized Ruth Keller in the second row, with her hands in her lap. Gus Ferris, who farmed a section north of town, was in the third row. The woman in the canvas jacket from the bank lobby was in the back row with her folder on her knees. Virgil looked at her for a moment before he turned toward the front. Earl was seated in the front row of the gallery with the county log book in a clear protective sleeve on the bench beside him. He looked up when Virgil came in and gave a single nod. The bank's legal team was already at their table, 3 attorneys in dark suits with matching portfolios. Preston Hale sat at the far end of the table nearest the gallery. He was in a charcoal suit today, different from the business casual he had worn at the farm. He did not look at Virgil when Virgil took his seat beside Nora. Judge Patricia Wren entered at 8:59. She was in her late 50s, gray-haired, and she moved to the bench with the economy of someone who understood that the pace of a proceeding was itself a form of authority. She reviewed the files in front of her for 2 minutes without speaking. The courtroom was quiet enough that Virgil could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. She said, "We are here on First Meridian Bank's emergency motion for a temporary asset freeze pending foreclosure action against the property of Virgil Cobb, Cedar Ridge Road, Polk County." She looked at both tables. She said, "I have reviewed the filings submitted as of 7 this morning. I have questions. We will hear from First Meridian first." The lead attorney for the bank was a man named Carver. He was polished and efficient. He presented the loan contract signed in 2003, the disbursement record dated March 14th, the accumulation of interest and penalties over 21 years, and the internal verification form bearing Gary Weston's signature confirming that valid identification had been presented at disbursement. He argued that the debt was fully documented, that the borrower had made no payment or inquiry in over 2 decades, and that the asset freeze was necessary to protect the bank's secured interest while foreclosure proceeded. He spoke for 11 minutes. His colleagues did not speak. Preston Hale watched the judge with the expression of a man who had already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. Judge Wren said, "Miss Briggs." Nora stood. She presented three things in sequence. First, the certified copy of First Meridian's own 2003 lending protocols, which she read into the record on the specific section requiring physical identification at disbursement and mandatory logging of that identification on a disbursement authorization form. Second, she formally noted for the record that the bank's evidence package did not include a disbursement authorization form, and that when she had formally requested it under federal disclosure provisions, the bank's attorney had stated it was no longer retained. She asked the judge to note the absence of a document that the bank's own protocols required to exist. Third, she presented the county logbook. She said, "Your Honor, I would like to call Earl Donovan to testify as to the origin and authenticity of this record." Carver was on his feet immediately. He argued that the logbook was a collateral matter unrelated to the loan documentation and that calling a witness at a preliminary motion hearing was procedurally improper. Judge Wren looked at him for a moment. She said, "Mr. Carver, the relevance of this record to the authenticity of your client's disbursement claim appears direct rather than collateral. I am going to allow it." She looked at Nora. She said, "Keep it focused, counselor." Earl walked to the witness chair. He moved without hurry. He identified himself, stated his position as former Polk County Sheriff, and identified the logbook as an official department record from his tenure. He stated that the entry dated March 11, 2003, was written and signed by him personally on the day the report was filed. He stated that the date on the entry could not have been altered without detection because the entries above and below it were part of a continuous handwritten sequence with matching ink throughout, and because the book had been held in the county archive under controlled conditions since the end of the 2003 fiscal year. Carver cross-examined. He asked whether Earl could confirm that the photocopy held by the defendant matched the original entry. Earl said he had compared them side by side, and the case number, date, description, and signature were identical. Carver asked whether it was unusual for an administrative loss report to be retained for 21 years. Earl said the county retained all administrative records for 30 years under state statute. He said he was glad they did. There was a sound in the gallery at that point, not laughter, more like the collective exhale of a room finding its level. Carver asked Earl whether he had received any communication from the defendant or his representatives suggesting how he should testify. Earl looked at Carver with the attention of a man who had spent 27 years asking questions rather than answering them. He said, "I received a visit at my home 2 days ago from a man who identified himself as a representative of First Meridian Bank. He told me that my testimony in this matter might prompt a review of my pension arrangements from the county." The courtroom went still. Judge Wren looked up from her notes. She said, "Mr. Donovan, are you stating that you received what you understood to be a threat related to your testimony in this proceeding?" Earl said, "I am stating what happened. Your Honor, I will let the court characterize it." Judge Wren looked at Carver. The attorney's expression had not changed in the deliberate way of a man working very hard to keep it that way. She said, "Mr. Carver, do you have any knowledge of a communication of that nature?" Carver denied it and stated that any suggestion of improper contact was categorically rejected by his client. Judge Wren made a note. She said, "We will return to that matter." She looked at Nora. She said, "Continue." Nora said, "Your Honor, I want to draw the court's attention to a specific fact. The bank's submitted record shows disbursement on March 14, 2003. The county logbook shows that Mr. Cobb filed a loss report for his driver's license on March 11, 2003, 3 days prior. Under the bank's own lending protocols in effect at that time, a disbursement without valid government-issued photo identification was not permitted. The disbursement authorization form that would have documented the identification presented does not exist in the bank's records. The bank states it was destroyed under their retention policy. We submit that it was never created because the disbursement, as recorded, never legally occurred." She paused. Then she said, We further submit that the internal verification form bearing Gary Weston's signature, submitted by First Meridian this morning, is not a document from 2003. We have engaged a forensic document examiner on an emergency basis. Her preliminary findings, which I am submitting to the court now, indicate that the paper stock and ink formulation in the submitted document are inconsistent with First Meridian's internal documentation materials from that period. Based on comparison with authenticated documents from the bank's own archive, we are requesting that the court order the original of this document held for full forensic examination and that the asset freeze be lifted immediately pending a full evidentiary hearing. Carver was on his feet again, objecting to the preliminary nature of the forensic report and the manner of its submission. Judge Wren said, "Sit down, Mr. Carver." He sat. She read the forensic examiner's report in full. The room waited. Preston Hale, at the far end of the bank's table, had stopped looking at the judge. He was looking at a fixed point on the surface of the table in front of him. His hands were flat and very still. Judge Wren set the report down. She said, "I am lifting the emergency asset freeze effective immediately." She said it without softening, without preamble. She said, "I am ordering the original of the Gary Weston verification document held by this court for independent forensic examination to be completed within 14 days. I am further ordering First Meridian Bank to produce the complete loan file, including all internal communications related to the Cobb account within 10 days. Without exception." She looked at Carver. She said, "Mr. Carver, I am referring the matter of the communication to Mr. Donovan to the State Bar and to the County Prosecutor's Office for review. I trust your client understands the gravity of that referral." Carver said he understood. Judge Wren said, "We will reconvene for the full evidentiary hearing in 3 weeks." She stood, and the room stood with her, and she was gone through the side door before the sound had fully settled. The bank's legal team gathered their materials in the efficient silence of people who had received a result they had been retained to prevent. Carver said something quietly to one of his colleagues. Preston Hale did not say anything to anyone. He picked up his portfolio and walked out through the main doors without acknowledging anyone at the table, without a backward glance at the room he was leaving. Virgil sat at the table for a moment while the gallery began to empty. Nora was making notes beside him. Earl came through the bar and stood next to Virgil's chair. He put one hand briefly on Virgil's shoulder and then removed it. That was all. Ruth Keller stopped at the bar on her way out. She said his name and nothing else. She looked at him for a moment with something in her face that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration, but something that contained both. And then she moved on. Gus Ferris stopped too. He said, "I've got an old loan with that bank, different branch, but same institution." He held Virgil's gaze. He said, "I am going home to find my paperwork." The woman in the canvas jacket was near the door, and Nora had already moved to speak with her. Virgil watched from a distance. The woman opened her folder and showed Nora something. Nora listened carefully and wrote something down. The 14 days the court had allotted for forensic examination passed without drama on Virgil's side of things. He planted the north section's cover crop. He repaired 60 feet of fence along the property line. He answered Nora's calls when she made them and responded to what she needed without asking for more information than she offered. The forensic examination report arrived on a Thursday. It was 43 pages long. The conclusion occupied 2 sentences. The Gary Weston verification form submitted by First Meridian Bank in the matter of Cobb versus First Meridian was produced on paper stock manufactured no earlier than 2019. The ink formulation was consistent with commercial printing processes adopted by First Meridian's document management vendor in 2021. The document was not from 2003. It had been created within the past 5 years and submitted to a federal court proceeding as evidence of a transaction that had occurred 21 years earlier. The county prosecutor's office, which had already opened a preliminary inquiry into the communication with Earl, expanded its investigation the same afternoon the forensic report was filed. 3 days later, the FBI field office in Des Moines received a referral. Two agents came to Nora's office to inform her that the investigation was widening and that her client should be aware. Nora came to the farm on a Saturday morning to tell Virgil what she had learned about Gary Weston. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her notes in front of her. The wooden box was on the window ledge behind her. She told him that Weston had not created the fraudulent document. In 2022, someone at First Meridian had contacted him and explained that a historical loan file involving his signature was being digitized as part of a records modernization program. He had been asked to sign a verification form confirming the accuracy of the original transaction records. He had signed it without understanding what it would actually be used for. When federal investigators showed him what had been submitted in court under his name, he had gone very quiet. Then he had asked for his own attorney. He told investigators what he remembered from 2003. He had been a junior loan officer, 22 years old, 2 years into the job. He had processed the Cobb application from start to approval. When Virgil came back without his license and the surgery was waiting, Weston had gone to his branch manager, Stuart Roth, and asked whether there was any flexibility given the circumstances. Roth had told him the disbursement would proceed regardless, that Weston's job was the paperwork, and not what happened after the paperwork was done. Weston had assumed a senior compliance workaround was being arranged through channels above him. The money was marked as disbursed in the system the following Monday. Weston had not asked again. He left the bank 4 years later and had not thought about the Cobb file until 2022 when someone called about the verification form. Virgil listened to all of it. When Nora finished, he said, "He was 22. Nora said, "Yes." Virgil was quiet for a moment. He said, "He has been turning away from me at the fair for 10 years because he knew something was wrong and he did not know what to do about it." Nora said, "That is what he told investigators." Virgil looked at the window behind her. He said, "What happens to him now?" She said, "He is cooperating fully. His attorney has been in contact with the prosecutor's office. He is likely to receive consideration for that." She paused. She said, "He is not the one who built this. He was a young man who did what he was told and spent 20 years not knowing the weight of it." The investigation continued to expand in the way investigations do when one file opens into a corridor and the corridor opens into a room with other doors. Auditors working from the county records Earl had helped locate identified 16 additional loan files at the Polk County branch with characteristics similar to Virgil's account. Active in the system, no disbursement authorization forms on record. Borrowers who were older, rural, with farmland as collateral. Borrowers who, in most cases, had never received the funds their files showed as disbursed. The woman in the canvas jacket was named Harriet Monroe. She was 73 years old and had farmed 160 acres outside of Granger since 1979 with her late husband. She had received a debt notice from First Meridian 2 months before Virgil received his, but she had not known what to do with it and had spent those months trying to understand the paperwork alone before someone told her about the hearing. Her loan file dated from 2001. The alleged debt was $640,000. She had never received a cent of it. There were 15 others like her. Some had already sold their land under pressure, not understanding they had any recourse. Some had paid partial settlements to make the notices stop. Some were still in the system, not yet contacted, waiting without knowing it. One afternoon in late June, 3 months after the hearing, Harriet Monroe drove out to Cedar Ridge. Virgil was replacing boards on the south fence when he heard a truck slow and stop on the county road. He looked up. The truck was an older model, dark green, and the woman who got out of it was wearing the same canvas jacket she had worn at the bank and in the courtroom. She walked up the fence line slowly, not in a hurry, and stopped about 10 feet from where he was working. She said, "I got the letter last week. They canceled the debt. All of it." He said, "Good." She said, "I heard it was your lawyer that got the auditors looking at the other files." He said, "Nora does good work." Harriet Monroe looked at the fence he was repairing. She said, "I almost sold the place in April. I had a buyer lined up. If the hearing had gone the other way, I would have been gone by May." Virgil drove a nail and did not say anything. She said, "My husband built that farm. We had it for 45 years. He said, 'Good land is worth keeping.'" She stood there for a moment longer. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I do not need you to respond to it." She looked at him directly. She said, "Thank you." She turned and walked back to her truck and drove away without looking back. Virgil watched the truck until it was out of sight. Then he turned back to the fence. Stuart Roth was indicted on charges of bank fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and misappropriation of loan funds in the first week of July. His attorney issued a statement calling the charges overstated. His former colleagues in the branch system, the ones still working for First Meridian's parent holding company, did not issue statements of any kind. They became very quiet and remained that way. Preston Hale was indicted 8 weeks after the hearing on charges of fraud, filing a false document in a federal proceeding, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. He posted bail and surrendered his passport. The holding company had terminated him 4 weeks before the indictment, having apparently conducted its own assessment of where the legal exposure was heading. On the day his indictment was announced, a brief item appeared in the Des Moines Register. Nobody in Cedar Ridge needed to read it to know what it said. The class action filing named First Meridian Bank, its parent holding company, Stuart Roth in his individual capacity, Preston Hale in his individual capacity, and 3 other bank officers whose involvement the disclosed internal communications had established. Total alleged damages across all plaintiffs exceeded $22 million. Nora filed Virgil's case separately because his damages were distinct enough to warrant it. The bank's holding company reached a settlement before the class action went to trial. The terms included full cancellation of the alleged debt, restoration of clear title to all 312 acres, and a financial payment. When Nora called to walk him through the final terms, Virgil told her to record the amount and send him the signature page. She said, "You do not want to know the number." He said, "I know what the land is worth. That is enough." He signed the agreement, and that was that. He did not tell anyone in Cedar Ridge what the settlement figure was. He did not buy anything new or make any changes to the house or the equipment that anyone around him would notice. There was a section of the south field that had needed tile drainage work for 3 years, work he had been putting off because of the cost, and he arranged for a crew to come out in late July and get it done. 2 weeks of equipment in the south field. People in town noticed it and talked about it the way people talk about things they cannot quite explain. Nobody asked him directly. Earl came by on a Wednesday afternoon in September. Virgil was at the north fence with a hammer and a bucket of nails. Earl pulled into the yard, got out, and leaned against the hood of his truck the way he always did, watching for a minute before he said anything. He said, "Drainage crew did good work down there," Virgil said. "Southfield was drowning itself every wet spring. Should have fixed it years ago," Earl said. 16 families got their debts cleared. Virgil drove a nail. He said, "I heard." Earl said, "Harriet Monroe came to see you." Virgil said, "She came by." "Yes." Earl said, "She told me what she said to you." He paused. He said, "The prosecutor asked if I wanted to make a statement for the press about what happened at my house. The visit. The pension comment." Virgil said, "What did you tell him?" "What did you?" Earl said, "I told him everything I needed to say was already in the court record." He paused again. He said, "I have never been a man who needed to say the same thing twice." Virgil made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh he had produced in several months. Not a large sound, just a breath with some warmth in it. They stood in the field for a while after that without talking. The September light was coming across the north pasture at a low angle, turning the dry grass a color that had no exact name, something between gold and pale gray. The cottonwood at the edge of the south field was visible from where they stood, still full at the crown, though the lower branches had started to turn. It was a large tree now. It had been a smaller one when Dorothy had chosen the spot beneath it. Earl left after a while, and Virgil kept working until the light was gone. That evening he sat at the kitchen table. He had moved the wooden box to the window ledge at some point in the weeks after the hearing, and left it there. He looked at it from across the table for a while. Then he got up and carried it back to the storage room and set it on the bottom shelf in the corner where it had always been. He placed the two cardboard boxes back in front of it exactly as they had been before he found it. He turned off the light and went back inside. He stood on the porch before going to bed. The night was clear, and the fields were dark in every direction. He could not see the cottonwood from the porch, but he knew its position. He had known it for 44 years. He stood there for a while without any particular thought, only the familiar weight of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He went inside and got into bed. His back hurt in the way that meant a full day's work had been done. The honest kind of ache that a man who has worked land his whole life does not mind much. He closed his eyes. He did not dream about the courtroom or the bank or the moment Preston Hale's face had gone still when the judge read the forensic report. He did not dream about depositions or auditors or the long corridor of 16 files that had opened into names and lives and farms that had been quietly waiting for someone to notice they were there. He dreamed about Dorothy. She was sitting at the kitchen table in the early morning the way she used to, before the sickness came the first time. She had a cup of something warm between her hands. She was looking out the window at the fields, reading something in them the way she always could, seeing what he usually missed. She was not saying anything. She did not need to. The land was there, and she was there. And the light was coming up slowly the way it does in Iowa in the spring, spreading flat and even across the fields until everything was visible, until there was nothing left that the light did not reach. He slept well. For the first time in a long time, he slept well.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy. The storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me. They were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey. Every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way. The mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken. I've known fear that stole my breath. I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher. Every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes obstacle and destination will never separate all this time. The road